a talk on the phone yesterday. It's just come round now. We're going to be doing a verification under the Food Act. Now, it's outcome based and it's risk based as well. So you're looking at the things that really might make people ill if they eat the food, if something's going wrong. And I'm only here for an hour or so for every 3 years. Goodness me. So for 99.9999% of the time, you're the ones that are managing the food safety in the business, and that's really important for you to sort of understand that, because let's put it this way, if I was to be managing your food safety, I'd be the one that would be following behind people every time they went to the toilet to wash their hands.
So in this one, 99.999% of the time they're in charge. No, actually 100% of the time they're in charge, even if he's there or not. He's never in charge of food safety. So, but the other thing about this introduction is he's in an early childhood education centre, and there's no sense that this early childhood education centre was ever under the old. So he spent an awful lot of time telling them what the old used to be, and I don't know whether there's value in that if you've never experienced the old. If you're in this brand new, I would encourage a focus on what it is that the system asks of you and your responsibilities within the system, but also about why it's important, why the decisions were made to include them in the system. Because in the early childhood education sector, that has been the biggest question. Why are we included? And he tends to be focusing on the change from an old system that they never felt engaged with, and not why they're involved in the new system.
I think that's a good point actually, because I was thinking we know that with ECE they really care about the kids. Like, that's their business, that's what they're there to do, and that's probably a good way to build rapport, because he's clearly trying to build up some of that rapport at the moment. And I like his style with his kind of plain language and how he's making it very real, and maybe just tailoring that even further to who he's talking to, why they are making food for somebody, and when it's coming to the kids, it's even more important here that for the quality of their business and for the safety of their children, that the food's safe.
Yeah. And I think if he was in a business that had been subject to the old, understanding that there's been a change is important. But again, he's not necessarily showing the benefits of the change. He's just outlining that there's been a change. And so it might be worthwhile that verifiers kind of do have a little bit of an idea about the benefits of the change, that they can then help the businesses to understand why it's important to engage and the benefits of verification to their food business.
I'm after standing over the chef while they're cooking the chicken and things like that. It just doesn't happen that way. So what we do with the verification, we're talking to people and the staff, and we get kind of like an idea and a feel for how they're kind of safe and suitable food. And do you know the difference? A lot of people don't know. Everyone knows what safe food is. Do you know what's suitable food? It's kind of, well, it's basically, is it what it says on the tin? So if you've got a can of beans and you open it up and it was a can of plates, disgruntled parents, any issues that you could think of at all?
No, there's often, you might have a sickness with children, as you say, it might not necessarily be confirmed as a norovirus, but
it's got a tummy bug basis.
Basis, so you have to make sure that it's like documented down in the
I'll tell you the really interesting
illness register.
Norovirus is a real terrible thing. I'll tell you this story, and it's absolutely true.
Sometimes Bob tends to cut off an answer. So in this instance, the ECE manager is busy about to tell him what happens when children are ill and how they manage that, and meanwhile Bob's launching into a bit of a story about norovirus or a previous experience, but he hasn't waited to hear the answer or whether or not that story is going to add to the verification, Or in fact, by launching into the story, is he in fact missing out on information that he needs for his verification?
Yeah, he's doing a lot of talking at this beginning bit. And I was going to mention about the bit where he talks about suitability, because we know from a survey that we did that a lot of people don't actually know what suitability means. So it's actually really good that out of those two issues he has focused in on that. But he probably does do a little bit there. He doesn't actually really wait for her to answer. But I'm guessing that's because he's trying to build rapport and not make her feel too uncomfortable. She does look a little bit nervous at the start. But yeah, I think that he explains it in a way that is really easy for someone to understand, which is really good.
Yeah, but in this case, in this particular case, he's launching into a story and she has raised her voice and her body language as "let me finish."
Yeah.
And so if his goal is to is to build rapport, then he does need to let her speak when she's willing or wanting to speak.
That's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, not a general criticism of Bob, but it is one thing that you do need to watch a little bit.
Yeah.
After I've done that, I'd like to come back and we go through anything that we've found.
Sure.
And just to explain things, and then we can sort of finish the verification. But main thing is I always like to say is that there's no surprises, so I don't go away from here shaking your hand and then you get some kind of letter in the post that says this wasn't right and that wasn't right.
Correct.
The main thing is it's just an exchange of information. So I'm not here as a kind of an inspector or a policeman or anything like that. I'm actually here for you. You know, I'm actually we're all on the same page, hopefully.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's the thing,
Thank
is
you.
to make sure that you can be confident that what you're doing is absolutely right. So the fourth one, which is the not so good, is where you have a non-compliance, and that's where something is, you know, the wheels have fallen off basically. And that would be something where, say, that there's raw chicken next to cooked ham or something like that, and I can see there's, you know, some real food safety risks. Worst case scenario, what happens there is that my job as a verifier then has to say, well, look, I have to stop now because we've got some what we call compliance issues here then. And if there's an immediate food safety risk, then we have to call in the cavalry, which is the food safety officer, and they'll come in because it's kind of, that's the kind of like where you've been caught speeding and doing 100 k's in a 50 k zone almost, you know, where this, so I'm just sort of explaining that.
In this section where Bob's talking about the non-compliance requiring the verification to stop, that's not how we envisage the process. So he's right in that he has an obligation and the business has an obligation to report that, and that an officer has the opportunity to decide to come in and take compliance action. But that doesn't mean his job as a verifier has stopped.
Right.
A verifier still has the responsibility to issue the corrective action request, to negotiate corrective action. In this case, they would likely be including the officer in that conversation about negotiating corrective action, because actually, if the corrective action can be managed through verification, the officer doesn't necessarily have to come in and do anything. The officer really only needs to get involved if there's wider investigatory work that perhaps needs to happen, or if the operator is basically saying, well, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to do it.
Right.
And then it becomes an officer thing. Otherwise, the verifier can still manage and work with that business to bring them back to compliance. So the finding of a non-compliance isn't the end of verification.
Okay. We know that's a really important area because people, the verifiers have talked to us about the lack of clarity for them around when one job starts and another one begins. So I think that's really important. I was just going to also mention, you know, the importance of thinking about where you are and has this person experienced a verification before. And I think it's good the way Bob goes through exactly what it all means. And I've heard verifiers say before, sometimes they don't understand why we're here. And so his emphasis on the why it's important and what can come from it, I think is really crucial, particularly as we know this is ECE, so they won't have been through this before.
Cool.
once the decision is made, then you have a right to review that decision under the food regulations. So if you're unhappy with what I told you, then you can go back to the agency I work for, or even the registration authority, and then you've got, I think it's about 15 days to do that, and then they have to come back within 20 days with determination. So there's a check and balance there, which you need to know about, which is important. Right, so that's great. We've had our discussion now, and look, I'm just going to go upstairs and talk to Kitty and go around the place and see what's what, and then probably about half an hour to an hour's time I can come down and we'll go through my findings.
Sure.
And we'll just have another chat before I leave you to it. All right?
Sounds good.
Excellent. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay.
I've got 3 points to make.
Okay.
I was thinking that when people go into these businesses, you probably can't underestimate how nervous that person might be, but the emotions that they show could come up in very different ways. So she looks a little bit nervous, and it probably doesn't help she's being filmed, but that person could also be angry, and I think that underlying that though it probably is a similar thing, which is someone's coming in to check on their business and tell them whether they're doing things right or not, and so just really having empathy for that person, understanding whatever's coming up for them is probably because you're there to check up on them, and I think Bob's really good at showing that kind of empathy and taking people through something and explaining it in a way that really works well for them. I've actually seen Bob do a few different verifications, and I find it really interesting how he changes his style depending on who he's talking to. And if he's speaking to somebody that he knows has a lot of understanding about kind of food science, he will actually change up his language and talk more technically with them. So I think that's a really important skill for a verifier, to be able to go, who am I talking to, what's their level of understanding here, and where are they at with what kind of stories will best work for them. And I think storytelling is a really good way to kind of bring to life the importance of some of the food safety and suitability issues. So I think that they're real strengths for Bob. The other thing is he gives her an opportunity to ask questions, and
Is there an opportunity to ask a question?
yeah.
And then once she's asked that question, which was a good question, and he responded really well, but then it's kind of like, right, we're moving on now. And I'm like, well, there might be more questions.
I thought it was interesting. So the one she did ask, though, was about the corrective actions, which shows me she's conscientious and she's concerned, like if anything was to come up, she's going to take it seriously. And, however they come across, they are going to be worried. It is their business, it is their livelihood, and they're going to be worried about you coming in today. And I think he takes that into account quite well. And I like the way he talks, like he is offering them a service and he is there to help, but he also gets that balance off. But he is checking up on them, and he is there to find out if there are any food safety and suitability problems.
So, and I don't know whether it was on camera or not, but I'm presuming that before they sat down to do this, he did introduce himself and go through his, his rights or not of being there. So his role as a verifier, and whether or not he has, is invited in to do the job versus is barging in to do the job. That's the only bit that we really kind of didn't see is that that real sort of introduction of who am I and why am I here. Yeah.
And actually that brings up a good point. I was thinking that, I'm not a verifier, but I wouldn't have realised how much went into that entry conversation. So that's 20 minutes. This whole thing is about an hour with the full verification and the exit. And I'm like, whoa, there's actually quite a lot of content in that introductory bit.
Yeah, but a lot of that is Bob driven, and it is a fair amount of repetition, and repetition is good in a lot of cases if you're trying to reinforce an idea or to change a behaviour. In this case, I'm not sure that he knew enough yet to know that it needed repetition, or whether it was more that that's a little bit of Bob's style, or even Bob's nervousness about being filmed and being in this sort of slightly unusual situation.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the entry interview needed to be 20 minutes.
Right.
You know, the entry interview is really that sort of first brush the formality part of it. Actually, what he did in this case was he did the entry, but he also did part of his verification.
Right.
He did part of his confidence and management verification and understanding what the manager knew about the processes and systems in place and how the manager was in control of the system. That's not entry interview, that's verification.
Okay.
So this is not 20 minutes of entry. He could probably have done the entry stuff in 5 or 10 if he wanted to, but his style has been to mix the entry and verification parts of the process together. And part of that is because in building rapport and having a conversation, you often get a better result than going in with a here's a part and here's some questions and it's kind of rigid. So he's actually doing a little bit.
Yeah, I think that works quite seamlessly.
Yeah.
He probably is talking more than I would imagine. Like, I think he's not actually asking her any open questions, so she doesn't actually get to talk that much for the 20 minutes.
No, that's right.
And I would imagine the balance would be better a little bit more the other way.
Yeah.